6. The principle of authority. Statist education and statist intervention in the life of the family leads progressively to the breakdown of the family. This is not surprising since the principle of authority is at stake in the family. The family is not only the first environment of the child, it is also his first school, where he receives his basic education, his first church, where he is taught his first and foundational lessons concerning God and life, his first state, where he learns the elements of law and order and obeys them, and his first vocation, where the child is given work to do and responsibilities in terms of it. The essential world for a small child is the family, his father and mother in particular. Meredith has summarized the matter aptly. In the eyes of a small child, a parent stands in the place of God himself. For the parent is the child's provider, protector, lover, teacher, and lawgiver. Hence it is that theologians through the centuries have taught obedience to civil magistrates and to all duly constituted authorities under the heading of the Fifth Commandment. It has been rightly seen how deeply involved all authority is in the authority of parents. The destruction of the family's position and authority is the destruction of all society and the introduction of anarchy. But the introduction of radical anarchy is also precisely that which follows systematically the attack on the family. The student revolution of the 1960s had basic to it anarchism. Thus, Georg Immendorf, aged 23 of Germany, called for revolution rather than reformation, because you can't improve junk, so revolution is the only answer. The need is to start from scratch with only one standard, life itself. Anthony Duckworth, 21 of England, states that at Oxford and Cambridge, the young teachers want to run administration policy, decide on books and courses, rooms and meals. They want to take charge. Moreover, according to John D. Rockefeller III, age 62, instead of worrying about how to suppress the youth revolution, we of the older generation should be worrying about how to sustain it. This youthful, quote, idealism, end quote, must be sustained according to Rockefeller and furthered. But what is it that Rockefeller asks us to sustain and accept? First, the student and youth revolution has an immoral premise. That is, the assertion that youth has a right to control and govern other people's properties. If a university belongs to the state, to a church, or to a private corporation, the student can receive an education there on the school's terms. He is free to create his own institutions, but as a student or an instructor, he is in a school on terms set by those whose property rights govern the school. The students bewail, quote-unquote, coercion, but their movements are among the most coercive of their century. The child has no right to govern his parents, the students their school, nor employees their employer. Second, the goal of the student revolution is simply a moral power, not quote-unquote idealistic hopes. To make life itself the standard is to say there is no standard save anarchy. To ask to start from scratch is to call for the destruction of all law and order so that the anarchist can seize what the present possessor possesses. Third, this anarchism is inevitable in a generation of students who have been taught neither obedience to parents and all due authority, nor honour towards them to whom honour is due. To cite Meredith again, the original command to honor father and mother applies to all of us throughout our lives. But in this place, children, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, specifically are told to obey their parents in the Lord. Because of his total lack of experience and judgment, it is absolutely necessary that a child be taught to obey his parents instantly and without question. Explanations and reasons for this may and should be given to the child from time to time. But at the moment a parental command is given, there may not be time or opportunity to give the reason why. Therefore, it is imperative that a child be taught the habits of unquestioning obedience to his parents. For until the young child develops, his parents stand to him in the place of God, and God holds them responsible for teaching and directing the child properly. By direct implication, a parent is bound by the fifth commandment to make himself honourable. For to be honoured, one must be honourable. Every parent needs to realise that he represents God to his child. The parent represents God because he represents God's law order. Judges in the law are referred to as gods, as are prophets. Exodus chapter 21 verse 6, chapter 22 verse 8, 1 Samuel chapter 28 verse 13, Psalm 82 verses 1 and 6, John chapter 10 verse 35. Since parents represent God's law order, they must, on the one hand, be obedient to that law order, and, on the other, be obeyed as representatives of that kingdom. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 6, the King James Version reads Judges, where the Hebrew reads Elohim, gods. The same is true of Exodus chapter 22, verse 8. The American Revised Version and the Masoretic Text Version read God and footnotes Judges. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 13, the witch of Endor, on seeing Samuel, cries out, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. Or, in the American Revised Version, I see a god coming up out of the earth. The prophet is clearly meant. In Psalm 82, verses 1 and 6, civil authorities are referred to as gods, a usage confirmed by Jesus Christ. John chapter 10, verse 35. For this reason, because all due authorities represents God's law order, the fifth commandment has often been associated with the first table of the law, that is, with those having reference to our duties to God as contrasted to the second table, those having reference to our duties to our neighbour. There is a validity to this division into two tables, although it cannot be pressed too far and is somewhat artificial, in that all the commandments have reference to our duty to God. Calvin regarded the division of this commandment into the first table as foolish. Curiously, he tried to use Romans chapter 13 verse 9 in favour of his position, as well as Matthew chapter 19 verse 19. But these passages are not conclusive on this matter. More pertinent are the various laws, previously treated, which relate obedience to parents to Sabbath keeping and the avoidance of idolatry. Compare Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 to 4. But to return to the more important point, the matter of obedience, it is commonly held by the humanistic mind that the unquestioning and faithful obedience required by the law of children is destructive of the mind. The free person, it is held, is a product of rebellion, of the constant challenge of authority, and true education must stimulate children and youth to break with authority and deny its claims. The, quote, culture, end quote, of youth today is this demand for instant realization combined with a defiance of authority. Ross Snyder, in Young People and Their Culture, writes that young people of our time are quite convinced that they are meant to be right now, and in all the fullness possible for them at their period of development. This demand for instant realization is a characteristic of infantilism. The baby cries when hungry and voids its bladder and bowels at will. It cries with frustration and rage when gratification is not instantaneous. It is not surprising that a generation reared permissively has a high aptitude for destructive and revolutionary rage, often accompanied by gleeful public urination and defecation, and a low aptitude for disciplined work and study. The essence of the revolutionary mind is the demand for instant utopia, for instantaneous gratification, and a destructive, infantile rage against any order which fails to provide it. Freud coined the terms oral and anal personalities. The terms are relevant to any age of maturity or to men of maturity. They are apt in describing the ambivalent personality of an infantile and permissive age and its peoples. But the roots go deeper. John Locke formulated the rootless psychology of the humanistic faith with his clean tablet concept. True education, he held, required that the mind be swept clean of all preconceived notions, implicitly of the teaching of parents, religion, and society. In terms of Locke's concept and psychology, education must be revolutionary. Add to this Rousseau's natural man, and all preconceived notions, all forms of inheritance from the past, become chains which must be broken. Marx and Freud drew the logical conclusion from the philosophies of Locke, Rousseau, and Darwin. Darwin, by his evolutionary faith, reduced everything in the past to a lower and more primitive level, and thus added justification to the demand for a clean sweep, for revolution. This hostility to discipline and obedience has invaded almost every area of endeavour in the 20th century. In art, the ability to master and use skills in use of paints and in draftsmanship is neglected in favour of spontaneous and unconscious expression lacking in reason and form. In religion, experience is given priority over or replaces doctrine. In politics, authority comes from below, from the lowest level, and the quote-unquote charismatic leader is the demagogue who can best satisfy the masses. In music, undisciplined emotionalism is most highly prized, and so on. The animosity towards obedience and discipline is general and deep. But the best functioning mind is the obedient and disciplined mind. The child who is disciplined into obedience is not the servile youth, but the freeman. He is, by virtue of the discipline of obedience, most in command of himself and best able to command in his field of endeavour. The older humanism, because it grew up in the context of a Christian discipline, could produce a disciplined mind. Montaigne, born 1533, in giving counsel on educating the child, spoke without any sense of novelty as he described good training in his day. A few years of life are reserved for education, not more than the first 15 or 16. Make good use of these years. Adults, if you wish to educate the child to the right maturity. Leave out superfluous matters. If you want to do something constructive, confront the child with philosophical discourses, those that are not too complicated, of course, yet those that are worth explaining. Treat these discourses in detail. The child is capable of digesting this matter from the moment that it can more or less manage for itself. Montaigne actually wrote, "From the moment it is weaned," but probably he did not mean that too literally. The child will, in any case, be able to stand philosophical discourses much better than an attempt to teach it to write and to read. This had better wait a little. Since, in Montaigne's day, the child was not weaned as hastily as in our own, there is no reason to doubt Montaigne's statement. In Puritan America, children were usually taught to read by their mothers between the ages of 2 and 4. Vandenberg cites 2 examples of mature children from Montaigne's era and later. They deserve citation in some detail. We do have some data on the child's nature in Montaigne's time. The life of Théodore Aquipin d'Aubigné, Huguenot friend of Henri IV, born in 1550. Montaigne was born in 1552, so he had reached the age of discretion when d'Aubigné was still a child. Observing young contemporaries of this d'Aubigné, Montaigne did not notice anything about maturation. Of d'Aubigné, it is told that he read Greek, Latin, and Hebrew when he was 6 years old, and that he translated Plato into French when he was not yet 8. Plato? Montaigne recommended the reading and explaining of philosophical discourses to children. Well, if an 8-year-old can translate Plato, what objections can there be to reading a translated version of him when he is 4? When d'Aubigné was still 8 years old, he went through the town of Amboise, accompanied by his father, just after a group of Huguenots had been executed. He saw the decapitated bodies, and, at the request of his father, he swore an oath to avenge them. 2 years later, he was captured by inquisiteurs. The 10-year-old boy's reaction to the threat of death at the stake was a dance of joy before the fire. The horror of the mass took away his fear of the fire, was his own later comment. As if a 10-year-old child could know what he meant by that. And yet, a child who had translated Plato and who has been used to reading classics for 4 years, could not such a child know what he wants and know what he is doing? But he can hardly be called a child. A person who observes the effects of an execution intelligently, who swears an oath to which he remains true through life, who realizes for himself the interpretation of the Holy Communion, and who fathoms the horror of death at the stake, he is not a child, he is a man. At the time Montaigne died, another child was standing on the threshold of great discoveries. Blaise Pascal, born in 1623, wrote, when he was 12 years old, without assistance, a treatise on sound which was taken seriously by expert contemporaries. At about the same time, he happened to hear the word mathematics. He asked his father what it meant, and he was given the following incomplete answer. Incomplete because his father was afraid that an interest in the mathematics might diminish his interest in other sciences. Mathematics, about which I shall tell you more later on, is a science which occupies itself with the construction of perfect figures and with the discovery of the properties they contain. Young Pascal brooded over this answer during his hours of leisure, and, unassisted, he constructed circles and triangles which led him to the discovery of the sort of properties his father must have meant. For instance, that the sum of the angles of a triangle equals 2 right angles. We must grant that Daubigny and Pascal were remarkable men and child prodigies. But it must be added that in music, the sciences, and in many other fields, child prodigies were far more common then than now. We must also recognize that the intellectual level then was quite high, even among the common people. The level of preaching is ample evidence of this. The ability of church members to listen to lengthy sermons of sometimes 2 hours, to reproduce all 30 or 40 points faithfully later in the week, and to debate them or discuss them is well documented. There was no lack of lawlessness in that era, but there was also a high order of discipline, and this discipline furthered the uses of intelligence. The men who, both in the early centuries of the Christian era and in the Reformation and later eras, established the foundations of Western civilization and liberty, were men of faith and discipline, men schooled in the academy of obedience. A godly respect for power and authority as duly constituted and ordained by God is required by Scripture. Thus, Exodus chapter 22 verse 28 declares, "Thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of thy people." Again, the American Revised Version translates gods as God and footnotes it as the judges. Calvin noted of this passage Leviticus chapter 19 verse 32, and Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 18 and chapter 20 verse 9. In the 5th commandments are comprised by synoptici, all superiors in authority. First of all, he commands that we should think and speak reverently of judges and others who exercise the office of magistrate, nor is it to be questioned that, in the ordinary idiom of the Hebrew language, he repeats the same thing twice over, and consequently, that the same persons are called gods and rulers of the people. The name of God is, figuratively indeed, but most reasonably applied to magistrates, upon whom, as the ministers of his authority, he has inscribed a mark of his glory. For, as we have seen, the honour is due to fathers, because God has associated them with himself in the possession of the name. So also here, his own dignity is claimed for judges, in order that the people may reverence them, because they are God's representatives, as his lieutenants and vicars. And so Christ, the surest expositor, explains it when he quotes the passage from Psalm 82 verse 6. "I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High." John chapter 10 verse 34. That is to say, that they are called gods unto whom the word of God came, which is to be understood not of the general instruction addressed to all God's children, but of the special command to rule. It is a signal exaltation of magistrates that God should not only count them in the place of parents, but present them to us dignified by his own name, whence also it clearly appears that they are to be obeyed, not only from fear of punishment, but also for conscience sake. Romans chapter 13 verse 5. And to be reverently honoured, lest God should be despised in them. If any should object that it would be wrong to praise the vices of those whom we perceive to abuse their power, the answer is easy. That, although judges are to be borne with, even if they be not the best, still, that the honour with which they are invested is not a covering for vice. Nor does God command us to applaud their faults, but that the people should rather deplore them in silent sorrow than raise disturbances in a licentious and seditious spirit, and so subvert political government. That such godly obedience does not constitute an endorsement of or a submission to evil is abundantly apparent from the history of the Old Testament prophets and from the history of the Church. Rather, godly obedience is the best ground for resistance to evil in that it stands primarily in terms of a higher obedience to God, and therefore is in obedience independent, and in resistance to tyrant, obedient to the higher authority of God. But, at one point, Calvin's comment reflects, in the first sentence of the second paragraph above, not biblical but Roman thought, when he compares rulers to parents and ascribes to them a parental authority. What is in common among parents, rulers, teachers, and masters is not parenthood, but authority. It is a serious error to ascribe a parental power to the ruler and the state. The parents represent the authority of God to the child. The civil magistrate or ruler represents the authority of God in terms of a civil law order to the citizens. They have, parents and rulers, authority in common, not parenthood, and even with respect to authority, it is of differing kinds. Roman law, because it divinized the state, made the state and its ruler in effect the god of the people, and the people the children of that god. The emperor was father of his country, and this was a serious aspect of the civil theology. The heavily classical learning of medieval and Reformation scholars often led them astray. A verse sometimes cited as evidence of the parental role of the state is Isaiah chapter 49, verse 23. But this verse refers to the remnant of Israel who shall be restored to Jerusalem and re-established as a state under the protection of other states, who shall be as nursing fathers. The reference is to the re-establishment of the Hebrew Commonwealth under Nehemiah with the protection of the Medo-Persian Empire. The imagery has nothing to do with a parental role for the state, and everything to do with the superior protecting role of a great empire for a small civil order which is reconstituting. The primary and basic authority in God's law order is the family. All other due authorities similarly represent God's law order, but in differing realms. If parents are not obeyed by children, no other authority will be honoured or obeyed. Hence, the law speaks of the key authority in terms of which social order stands or falls. Basic to the authority of every realm is a representation of God's law order. The state, thus, is established in order to extend God's justice. According to Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 to 20. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgments. Thou shalt not wrest judgments. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift. For a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. That which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live, and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. It would be ridiculous to posit fatherhood as a purpose of this law. Its goal is civil justice. Basic to the establishment of that justice is authority. And the fifth commandment, as it speaks of parents, and by implication, all God-ordained authorities, is establishing, first of all, God's authority. God knows, after all, that parents and rulers, churchmen, teachers and masters are sinners. God is not interested in establishing sinners. The expulsion from Eden and the constant judgment in history is eloquent evidence of that. But God's way of disestablishing sinners and establishing his law order is to require that authorities be obeyed. This obedience is, first of all, rendered to God and is a part of the establishment of God's order. Sin leads to revolutionary anarchy. Godly obedience leads to godly order.